All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to attempt in the next 20 to 30 minutes to walk you through building a agentic framework, quote unquote, from scratch. I say I am going to use multiple shortcuts for an enterprise class application. I'll try to caveat along the way where the shortcuts really shouldn't be, but I'm trying to boil this down to something that like a developer two could grasp and potentially implement for you or your organization so that you can at least start toying with and playing with using large language models beyond just a chat window. So to do this, I'm going to be using a couple of bespoke technologies, but you can swap them all the way. Obviously, I'm running not Windows, I'm running Arch Linux. That's just my preferred, run around and do stuff at home operating system because I have control over it to a larger extent than I do Windows. I do most of my business work on a Windows machine. It just so happens that I'm traveling right now, so it's easier for me to do it on this instead. I'm going to leverage a particular terminal tool called tgpt, which I have up here, which give it a try. It's actually very extensible and very feature rich as far as I can tell. It supports almost all the major models that are out there now, the free and paid ones. So you can basically plug in an environment variable with your API key and start using O3 or Gemini Pro, what have you. I'm actually going to do everything using Find, which is a free model. I'm going to, just to kind of prove the point that you don't actually need to go pay for a subscription. You can use one of the free or smaller models. I may make a different version of this that's using Olama locally so that I can say it's completely independent of any of these model providers so that you can essentially let it run overnight without worrying about it like costing you $1,000 and it can compute and think and work. The installation for Linux is very straightforward. You pretty much just pull up a terminal window and type um, sudo pacman. For in the case of Arch dash S tgpt, if I can type, enter your password, and it'll ask you. Now, I already have it installed, so I'm not going to do this, but it's essentially whatever your flavor of Linux is for the install command for Windows. There's a um, instruction set here. You can use Chocolatey if you're in the Node.js universe. You're familiar with that. You can use Scoop. Um, and then there's also instructions to just run it on Mac OS. I'm not familiar enough with Mac to even hazard to explain how this should just work, but apparently this should just work. And feel free to check it out, give it a like, give it a star. It definitely is useful. I'll probably use it for smaller projects for sure, because the interaction from the terminal to what I'm going to be doing with .NET Core in the example to call and feed information is extremely lean as far as like the overhead to work with. You take the dependency on the tool, but obviously if you're running an enterprise system, there's a good chance you can get this tool installed and configured on a on a virtual machine somewhere or a Docker container and just use it from there. And then you don't have like you abstract away all the pain of trying to interact with different things. Obviously, there's some limitations, being that it's terminal. Like in order to get like files and stuff in, you got to go through extra hoops. But for the purposes of today, we're just dealing with essentially knowledge transformations. It works perfectly fine. Supports the various switches for like how you interact with it in the terminal, and you can on the individual call kind of custom tailor what model you use, what the provider is, et cetera, et cetera. So very, very nice, very lean and straight to the point. Very good job from what I can tell. Me just use it in a vacuum a little bit just to kind of show how this would operate. So if I go into a terminal and I just do tgpt and I ask it a question, what is the greatest programming language? And obviously you get the I'm going to plead the fifth answer where it tells you all the languages are great, but you get the idea of how it responds. And then from there you can do we won't be using these, but just for the sake of completeness, you can do interactive, where it's essentially a REPL and it'll keep state within itself. So I can be like, hi, what did I just say? Oh, interesting. This worked yesterday. Okay. We won't be using the context from within this anyway, so um I know this worked yesterday. Come back to that. That's not the point of the video. The other parts that I want just to kind of highlight, obviously we'll be using .NET, .NET 9 specifically, and we'll be using VS Code for development. I'm gonna kind of branch off from here and start looking at some code that's already been implemented, just because it's a little bit easier to talk to something that you can see on the screen. So the first kind of connection point, if you're familiar with C Sharp, then this is easy to stare at. If you're not, I'll narrate it as best as I can. We're essentially wrapping the terminal call like an in and out of process request, hence the start process, and basically routing all of the input and output, error and input to things that we can control from in the code. So in this example, I'm just passing in like what the actual command is and then creating it. And then whatever the text is, that's that first argument that we saw earlier when we started typing the question, what's the greatest programming language? That's going to get passed in to the process as the first argument. So the first question. So this is essentially taking all the defaults, just like we did in the terminal, just passing whatever we're passing programmatically as the question or the content, and then taking the output back and returning it to the method. So it's essentially an out of process call acting as our interface to whatever the large language model you would want to talk to. If you're talking directly to the API, let's say you're using OpenAPI's Responses API, or you're using Gemini's API or Anthropic, you could theoretically start here and just pull in their SDK, configure their endpoints, the models, the API keys, everything, and run with it. You could actually just use this same client with a different implementation or pull off an interface from this and just have multiple options. Either way, this is your entry point to the LLM. So I start here. So we went from a terminal command, right, and a tool that we could get off the shelf, quote unquote, installed on Linux, to a programming class that wraps that so we can call it in the code programmatically. And then from there, we have our program. Our program is very simple. We're grabbing configuration information for paths. So conceptually, there's two kind of things you need to consider when you're putting together different agents or personas, or to the degree you call it an agent is whether or not it operates with tools. At least that's my current working opinion of what really makes an agent. Really, in this example, it's not going to go like send emails or do anything crazy like that. It's going to operate from the position of a role, right? At that point, you're basically saying, LLM, act like this type of person, act like a security analyst, act like a software engineer. Consider these specific things when you're responding. That persona, that pre-prompting configuration, those are what I'm referring to here as templates. And then session is just the historical log of all the interactions that are happening, just so that it's captured. You can kind of look at what the interactions were after the fact, after it runs through the graph. So the rest of this is just boilerplate to kind of uniqueify each individual question when it's run through. And then there's a couple of unique components further down the line. One is this architecture review service, which we'll get to last because that's kind of the crowning piece that makes this all kind of come together. The part that I'll jump into next, though, is just this concept of templates. So I have several quote unquote roles here: security reviewer, performance reviewer, UX reviewer, software architect. Sure, should be just software architect reviewer. This group of roles, I should say, and give my later point away, is passed in as a collection to this service. Each one of those represents a template. So if we look at the templates, we'll start with the simpler ones, say security reviewer. All these are is initial starting prompts for the model to say, you're a security reviewer, here's some things to consider. So if you're building out a very simple example, let's say you want to do like cursory software architectural proposal review, just because I'm in security, I'm in software engineering and architecture, that's the one that I can just kind of rattle off. But like you might have an example where it's like a sales pipeline or process or a client, a lead qualification process where you get some raw material from a customer or client prospect and you just want to vet it through stuff you already know. Do they have this? Do they act like this? Do you use red flags? You would build out these templates rather than look at it as like, well, let me make one giant model. Let me break it down into the logical component parts and say, all right, here's the specialist information that would really deduce from what we gave a conclusion. So in this particular example, I have security reviewer persona, which basically says you're just going to review the question for any potential security concerns, or really the content that's passed in, not necessarily the question. We'll get to that a little bit later. And then I just kind of have, several of these. Like we want to consider like performance and scalability. We want to consider data integration. We want to consider cost. And they're all just kind of spelled out, kind of like what you'd have in a giant checklist for an architectural review. So in a sales checklist, you might have are they the right ICP? Do they have the right size and shape? What are the personality traits? What are their main concerns? And you could build out each of these templates to say, all right, mine all this information from the content and come back with a here's all the things based on what they said that qualify as red flags or green flags, et cetera, et cetera. The main point being each of these personas is a manageable unit of work, right? It's proxying for a human having to put the hat on and go interact with the content and produce a result. It can't replace the human because this might actually flag stuff that's red that should be green or vice versa, but it can produce starting material that, for the obvious stuff. Like if a customer says, well, I don't want to pay more than $5 for this, and you're a software company. Obviously, that's a red flag. That's the system can pick that up for you. But if it's the customer seems reluctant to spend that a large amount of money up front or something, that might require a human to really evaluate it. But you can still surface that here, right? The nice thing about the large language model is you can arbitrarily build the categories of like high, medium, low risk, concern, things to follow up into the initial personas, and then they can flag them along the way. So if you take your content or your question, which I'm going to ask once I kind of talk through this, and ask it of each of these different personas, they're going to have different feedback, different results. So if you take an email from a customer and feed it through, a sales process pipeline, each of those individual templates are going to give you different feedback. But then what you do, if you think of it like, tiers in an organization or fundamentally a neural network, that's layer zero, right? All the inputs. Here's 5 inputs, the inputs from these 5 or 6 reviewers and the outputs. Take the question, ask it of each, get the results. Those results in the real world, your initial, like your tech analyst, your frontline sales rep, they take that and they go to an account manager, and they've at that point they've curated what the question is from the customer. The customer says, "I hate your software." That probably isn't going to be what the sales rep, they're going to qualify that a little bit more and take it to the account manager and says, the customer's unhappy that thing doesn't work this way. That's the first step in the layer. So each of these 5 or 6 personas are all going to just take the first step. Then you have the next level where positionally, let's say your account manager, your CFO, your CEO, they take information and they are looking for different things coming out of it. So it's kind of moving to the next layer, take that input. In the example here, all of these initial level ones are going to get fed into the architecture and software engineer roles, in addition to what I'll call the project manager aggregator role, which just takes everything and rolls it up into one unit, consolidating. That's all going to happen after all of these have one pass at it. So each of these is going to get the question, whatever I put in, take their output. It's going to get consolidated one as one output. The output of that, it plus the architecture persona plus the software engineer persona are going to have feedback on that aggregated amount. And then those three again will get aggregated a final time for the output by the same project manager role, the aggregator role. So there's essentially three levels to the network. There's five inputs, three middle, and then one out, which is a very simple network. If you've got a much more complicated process, obviously multi-stages, you would build it out to represent the flow that information has to go. The nice thing about programming is it can be flexible enough that it isn't just a straight reduce, right? Five inputs, three at the next level, and then one. It could go five and then three, and then at three you decide, oh, this actually has to add this optional thing into the mix, and then it goes to four, and then down to two, and then to one. At that point, you're looking at trying to essentially build out all the relevant points in the process, representative as LLM instances, templates, personas, agents, whatever. And that whole like process just operates like, a business process would. It's just happening programmatically at a smaller level using a large language model to kind of broker the nodes rather than have like traditionally you look at a neural network and it's like, well, you're going to give it a bunch of numbers and it's going to do a reduce function and give you an average or something. And then that's going to feed to the next node. And that's how you learn at the fundamental level. This is more on like a logical conceptual level. So like the nodes can be very meaningful, right? Here's your CFO, here's your CI, here's your InfoSec. I can't remember the right acronym off the top of my head. Here's your CTO. Like here's the things they care about. And those feed into the CEO role, potentially being used to produce content for board members because it's considering all the things that all the executive levels want to have known and heard when you're producing content in a content generating space. Here you could use this. You start with a very basic question that doesn't consider all the things you know it needs to consider, but you have codified all those things that you should consider when asking a question rather than have to have five or six people in a room. So if your architects and senior engineers and security analysts can all come up with content that if an LLM would consider, they would surface when certain types of questions are asked, you can codify that process and they don't have to go to so many meetings, which I honestly I think is the most compelling use case for something like this anyways. Build out a graph that sort of represents a light version of your organization and let it handle 70-80% of the dumb questions. Not dumb, but the questions that are asked the same way, the same different ways, but it's the same question over and over and over again. So people don't have to be in meetings. Instead, they just have to make sure there's an instance of a persona, an LLM, an agent that best mirrors how the organization should be for their particular role. Essentially, their sidekick, their proxy. Then part of their job is just to make sure that thing stays current and up to date, and then you can surface that. So I've talked a lot about this. I'm going to now run the example and then get into kind of how this works. So if I just do a simple start with debugging, then we'll let this boot up. I am very basic. If you noticed in program.cf, there's no console write line before the read line. Like it's literally just blank. I just have to punch my question in. So the review, or I should say the interactions with each of these templates are done through the session manager class. And all this is doing is pulling in the template and um, looping over and pulling in all the content that the template has into that starting interaction as well as the session history. So like if you ask, because that's how LLMs work, right? You're chaining all the inputs together. So your initial template, and then you ask the question, it sends the initial template plus the question, then it takes the output. In the case of the aggregator, it's going to take all the outputs from all of these, and that's going to be the initial input, along with the starting prompt, which is to consolidate this or something to that effect. Yeah. Review the inputs for roles and organize it. So the code really is just taking that and orchestrating it here. Like there's not much else going on other than you're taking the input, it's creating a session, it's storing the log file. You can see some test runs before with content coming out. In my case, I'm actually taking the template and then just appending what it says onto the end of it, right? So you can see my question, what should I build my site? And then the response came back. And each of those is getting stored, as an organized group here. So like each run This one has two because it's run twice. Because it runs in the middle layer and then in the last layer. So there's actually two executions of that one template in this particular question. So when this runs, it all gets grouped by a key. That's what this folder is. So each of those, the content produced by each of the executions with the individual personas, you can see here just by clicking through it. It's like this is the data reviewer. So the template from this run, consider, boundaries and responsibilities, blah, 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 blah. So talk is cheap. Let me run this. And then we can look at the resultant output. So design a web API. The most generic question you could ask a developer. I need an API. Well, for what? What are you building? What type of security does it need? What type of tool should it use? How secure does it need to be? You've already engineered all the basic questions into the framework here, so they all just take that question and ask it that exact particular way. And then the final result is all those basic institutional knowledge personas, LLM agents, whatever you want to call them, all had their output. And then the final result ends up being content highlighting all the topics you would want to be considered when you're designing an API, as well as recommendations around different technologies, specifically pointing to stuff in the .NET ecosystem in this example, because the template of the software engineer is specifically targeting Azure and .NET 8. So you don't even have to know what to ask. You could just say, hey, I think we need this type of app. If you've built out the framework the right way with the right people maintaining the right content, they can brainstorm with it, come up with something that should pass the sniff test before they even bring it in front of a meeting. All the content that you'd create here would then end up being collateral to that meeting. So it's not several rotations of meetings and questions and interactions. You could actually let the computer gyrate on, 60, 70% of what you need before you actually have to get all the executives in a meeting. Saves a ton of time, also saves a lot of typing. So this is a very elaborate output for a free model, and that's partly because all of this templating up front has already been done that houses that content. So if I go find the run that we just did, which I'm going to guess is the one at the top. No, it's not the one at the top. Yeah, I think it's this one. If I'm recognizing the timestamps right. All the output from all of the different executions all got rolled into here, and then that assistant is just responsible for kind of pulling it all together. I won't dig too much into the text. You can kind of see it here. The point being, you can build this. You don't need um you don't necessarily even need to go talk to OpenAI or any of these larger bodies of AI sort. You can just find a free model. You've got obviously Facebook Meta is in this space a lot right now with their open source models. You've got Find, you've got Mistral. There's all sorts of ways you could actually be experimenting with producing high quality output by just building out these steps and then codifying them for a valid use case. Not necessarily a general purpose one. That gets really complicated. Um, but in this specific example, where I'm just doing some basic software engineering, all those reviewer templates, so coming back to the code, in here, right, I have this list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 specific templates that I'm calling out. All I'm doing is taking my question, which I asked, which is, do I build a web API, and feeding it to each of those in a loop. For each of those review templates, go ask this question. And I get the result, I capture it. That's layer one. Layer two, I take all those results, I put them all together, and I feed them to the aggregator and say, give me an aggregation of this. That's simply for convenience. You could do that different ways, right? You could say this output goes to this node, this output goes to this other node. Depends on the processes you're trying to do. This is just a straight reduce in the sense that I have 5 or 6 templates giving input. And at the end of the day, I just need one big output that has everything kind of summarized. You could have multiple steps for each independent paths, convergent paths where the outputs of two nodes go to one node, or one node goes to two other nodes. At that point, you just need a process map, like literally on a whiteboard. Just say this person talks to this person, that person talks to this person talks to this person. These two people talk to this one person after this other person. Draft it out on a whiteboard. That's just business process, people navigation. Once you have that together, you can codify it, just like I have here. Take that output, feed it to the next level in the chain, in this case, architecture and engineering. Take those outputs and roll them up again and summarize them so that it doesn't sound fragmented, like it's multiple things just chained together. The LLM is great for that. So, and in my example, and at the beginning I said I would call this out. Obviously, I'm storing everything in file system, like everything is a file in this example. You could build a nice little interface that lets you manage templates, web page, and then you just build out the prompt templating there. You build a little REPL that basically works off of that same model, whatever model you choose. Let's say you did use, OpenAI. You could just build a light version of ChatGPT and iterate on that in the browser until you have the right set of steps. Save it, codify it, store it in a database, and then your agentic framework, whatever you're building, draws from that. Capturing session and context, in this case, is really for logging for the purposes of using this in a production environment as opposed to just a development environment. So like you probably wouldn't need to worry about some of this if it's just back end, uh, efficiency tooling, right? But if you were going to surface this as part of like a product or something, obviously you'd need like full auditing and traceability on all of the content that was generated, how it was generated, what version of what template fired at what time, right? Which would mean you'd have to catalog all of these information, be able to trace it back to the person, the place, and everything. So a relational database with pointers or something similar is probably not actual programming point, but like references to files that are stored somewhere. All of that is stuff you'd want to consider if you were going to build this all the way up to production use. If you're just looking for a way to manage what is probably a significant amount of prompt engineering sprawl that has happened within your organization and you don't even realize it, this would be a good light tool to stand up. Obviously, once it grows, you might need the help of someone like me or someone else that's familiar with software engineering and architecture and a good way to organize it so it can like run forward and manage like into the future. Because this type of approach, in my opinion, is going to just expand and expand and expand. And there's a handful of tools that are starting to think about doing this, but none of them are thinking about it like potentially the way that your business would think about it. So this is a good candidate for any engineers you have that are chomping at the bit. I would say to play with AI is to find a process that might benefit from something like this and then build it and then see if it adds benefit. And the really cool thing is, if you build it like this, it's basically model agnostic. So you could plug and play. In my example, I'm just using this terminal tool, right? You could spin up a Docker container with this, and that's part of the deployment. And let's say you don't want to use that. Let's say you want to talk to just OpenAI. Well, the way this is put together, you just need to plug and play this. But as long as you keep the parts separate, right? The actual framework is separate from the model you could, as new, O5 comes out in a year and you want to take advantage of its, uh, ability to predict the future. I don't know what it's going to have for features. It would just be a matter of plugging that into their API, which should still be backwards compatible at that point. And then now you're using the updated model. So your business process gets codified in the relationships, the graphs, and the templates. The power of the model and its ability to think and deduce and consider is something you can swap out underneath, which I think is really cool. The other neat thing about this is the power and configuration still lives in your organization. So you're not reliant on a model being updated. You can just give it the content that it would need to make the decision, and it's kept in manageable chunks this way. I'm sure there's a bunch of other ways you could put together, a basic framework like this, but I just kind of wanted to put this together to just kind of show that you don't need like a PhD or one of these giant um, enterprises that are currently, obviously they're going to have good products, but a lot of places aren't necessarily going to be able to like jump on that and fully leverage it without fully understanding it. So I wanted to put something together that kind of could showcase like basic use case, very simple, very targeted, very finite, um, agentic workflow. So thanks for watching.